So Erika Kirk actually had two boyfriends within the 5 years before meeting Charlie Kirk. So why lie about this?
We went to Maggiano's. I picked her up. It was raining.
It was.
Kind of different night in Arizona, and picked her up at her house, and later met her mom on the first night.
It's a big deal for the
Exciting
first
stuff.
night.
Yeah, not trying to scare her off.
Nobody was ready for how fast this hit, and nobody was prepared for what the footage actually suggested. When clips allegedly connected to Erika Kirk began circulating quietly before exploding across timelines, the shock wasn't just about what was shown, it was about what it contradicted. Because for months, maybe longer, the public version of Erika Kirk had been carefully managed, controlled, calm, polished. Every appearance reinforced the same image, composed, intentional, unbothered by noise. And that image held, right up until the moment it didn't. The footage didn't arrive with a press release. It didn't come with context. It surfaced the way the most dangerous stories do without explanation, forcing everyone to draw their own conclusions. Fans didn't immediately react with outrage. They reacted with disbelief. Is this recent? Why does this look different from everything she's been saying? Why hasn't anyone addressed this yet? Those questions spread faster than the clips themselves. According to people who claim to have seen the footage early, what made it so unsettling wasn't that it showed chaos, it showed contrast. A version of events that didn't align with the narrative people thought they understood. Tone, timing, behavior. Moments that, when isolated, might have meant nothing but together felt inconveniently revealing. And the most shocking part? The source wasn't anonymous insiders. It wasn't industry gossip. It was someone from her past, an ex. That detail changed everything. Because when footage comes from someone who shared private space, private time, and private conversations, the public doesn't just ask, is this real? They ask why now, and timing in moments like this is never ignored. Within hours, fan communities were split down the middle. One side urged caution, reminding everyone that clips without context can be misleading. The other side couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random, that the footage surfaced exactly when silence was becoming too comfortable. And then came the silence. No immediate denial, no clarification. No attempt to reframe the moment, just distance. That silence hit harder than the footage itself. Because when a public figure responds quickly, it suggests control. When they don't respond at all, it suggests calculation. And calculation tells the audience there's something being weighed: risks, narratives, fallout. Fans began revisiting old statements, old interviews, old explanations that once felt sufficient but now felt incomplete. Small inconsistencies suddenly mattered, phrases were replayed. Pauses were reinterpreted. What once felt like confidence now felt rehearsed. That's when shock turned into scrutiny. The footage didn't need to prove anything, it only needed to raise doubt. And doubt, once planted, doesn't require confirmation to spread. It grows through silence, through delayed responses, through the uncomfortable realization that people may not know the full story. Insiders say the reason this moment feels explosive is because it challenges credibility, not character. It doesn't accuse, it contradicts. And contradictions are harder to dismiss than allegations. This isn't a viral scandal built on exaggeration. It's a slow burn exposure built on discrepancy. And the fact that it came from an ex adds a layer no PR strategy can erase, because shared history carries weight. And shared footage carries even more. Right now, the internet isn't asking for answers. It's asking why answers are taking so long, and that delay is doing more damage than any clip ever could. Because once fans feel like something is being managed instead of explained, they stop waiting for truth. They start assembling it themselves. And this story is only at the beginning. To understand why this footage detonated the way it did, you have to understand the version of Erika Kirk people thought they knew, and how carefully that version had been constructed over time. Public perception doesn't just happen. It's built through repetition, tone, and the strategic absence of contradiction. And for a long while, that structure held. On the surface, Erika Kirk represented composure. Every public appearance reinforced the same energy, controlled language, deliberate pacing, and an insistence on forward motion. When controversy brushed close, it was deflected with calm. When questions lingered, they were reframed. The result was a narrative that felt complete enough to stop digging. That completeness mattered. Because when audiences feel like they understand someone, they stop interrogating the gaps. They accept explanations at face value. They assume consistency even when they don't actively verify it. That's how credibility becomes ambient present without being tested. Insiders say that was the environment surrounding Erika's image for months. Not because nothing challenged it, but because challenges never arrived with enough weight to force confrontation. Rumors stayed rumors, questions stayed speculative, and speculation, without friction, fades. Until it doesn't. The The background that fans are now revisiting isn't about a single relationship or a single statement, it's about patterned messaging, how stories were told, which details were emphasized, which timelines were smoothed over. None of this looked suspicious on its own. In fact, that's what made it effective. Consistency is persuasive. But consistency also becomes fragile the moment a credible contradiction appears. That's why the source of the footage matters so much. An X isn't a random observer. An X is someone who existed before the narrative settled. Someone who experienced unfiltered moments, off-camera conversations, and versions of behavior that never needed to perform. When footage comes from that position, audiences don't immediately assume malice, they assume proximity. And proximity changes how people weigh information. According to those familiar with the situation, the relationship in question ended quietly, without public fallout. No dramatic implosions, no online back and forth. That silence was interpreted as maturity on both sides, a clean ending, a closed chapter. But closed chapters can reopen if the story they support starts to feel incomplete. The footage didn't just surface randomly, it appeared after long periods of public calm. That timing is why fans are uneasy, not because the clips are definitive, but because they introduce temporal friction. Moments that don't sit neatly inside the accepted timeline. Reactions that don't align with explanations previously given. And once timelines stop lining up, people start asking better questions. Why was this moment never referenced? Why does this tone feel different from the one presented publicly? Why hasn't this been addressed directly? Those questions aren't accusations, they're requests for coherence. The background pressure here comes from the realization that credibility isn't destroyed by wrongdoing alone, it's destabilized by discrepancy. When audiences notice that two versions of events can't both be true, they don't immediately choose one. They wait, they watch. They listen for how the person at the center responds. That response, or lack of one, is now part of the story. Insiders note that the silence following the footage's spread wasn't interpreted as shock. It was interpreted as deliberation. Deliberation implies stakes. Stakes imply vulnerability. And vulnerability invites scrutiny. This is why the background matters more than the footage itself. The clips didn't land in a vacuum. They landed in a narrative ecosystem that had already been trained to expect clarity and control. When clarity paused, the ecosystem reacted. Fans began re-examining moments they hadn't questioned before. Interviews where answers felt carefully worded. Statements that emphasized certain details while skirting others. Even body language, once dismissed as personal style, was reconsidered in light of new context. That's not fair. But it's human. Because once doubt enters, everything gets re-evaluated. The background tension also includes expectation management. Erika's audience had been conditioned to believe that if something mattered, it would be addressed cleanly and promptly. That expectation now collides with a waiting period that feels unusually long for someone known for control. And waiting creates narrative space. Space for interpretation, space for comparison, space for others to speak. This is why the footage feels like a pressure point rather than a scandal. It didn't create chaos. It revealed fragility. The fragility of a story that relied on uninterrupted consistency to remain intact. None of this proves intent. None of this assigns guilt. But it does explain why fans feel shocked. Because shock doesn't always come from what's seen, it comes from realizing that what you thought you understood may not be complete. And that realization is where this story truly begins. The conflict didn't ignite because of what the footage showed. It ignited because of what it forced everyone to confront at the same time, that two versions of the same story could no longer comfortably coexist. That's the first twist. Up until now, the conversation around Erika Kirk had been anchored in stability. Even when questions surfaced, they were absorbed into a broader narrative of growth, privacy, and forward motion. Nothing ever stuck long enough to demand a reckoning. The system worked because it didn't need to explain everything, it just needed to remain uninterrupted. The footage interrupted that. Not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. According to people familiar with how it spread, the clips didn't go viral immediately. They circulated in small clusters, first group chats, niche forums, private messages. That matters because it meant early viewers had time to watch closely, not react emotionally. They noticed details, tone, timing, the way moments unfolded without the polish people were used to seeing. And that's when the discomfort set in. Because the conflict wasn't about wrongdoing, it was about contrast. The footage didn't scream chaos, it whispered inconsistency. And inconsistency is far harder to dismiss than shock. The first real fracture happened when fans began comparing the footage to past public statements, not to catch lies, but to look for alignment. What they found instead was tension. Small, but noticeable. A phrase that now felt incomplete. A timeline that felt compressed. An explanation that suddenly felt rehearsed rather than organic. That's when the narrative stopped being passive. The X's role became central at this point, not as an accuser, but as a context holder, someone who existed in a period before the public narrative settled into its final shape. That positional difference matters, because it reframes the footage not as an attack, but as a counter-memory. And counter-memories are destabilizing. Insiders say this is when private conversations shifted tone, not, "Is this true?" but "How does this fit?" That question alone changed the stakes. Because fitting implies there's something to integrate, not dismiss. Here's the unexpected twist that caught even longtime observers off guard. The X didn't immediately push the footage harder. No interviews, no captions explaining intent, no attempt to dominate the narrative. That restraint confused people, because restraint suggests confidence or patience, and patience suggests that the footage wasn't meant to explode, it was meant to sit. That's dangerous. When information sits without commentary, it invites interpretation. It forces the person at the center to decide whether to address it proactively or let the audience assemble meaning on their own. Both options carry risk. Address it too quickly, and you elevate it. Wait too long, and you confirm it matters. This is where the conflict sharpened. Fans started asking why the response window felt different this time, why the usual mechanisms, clarification, reframing, moving on, weren't activated immediately. That delay didn't read as panic, it read as calculation. Calculation is the moment credibility gets tested. The twist isn't that the footage exists, it's that it created a scenario where any response could be misread. A denial could feel defensive, an explanation could feel selective, silence could feel strategic. There was no clean move left. Insiders describe this as a classic narrative bind, when a story's power doesn't come from accusation, but from ambiguity. Ambiguity keeps attention without making claims. It's sticky, it lingers. And the X's continued quiet amplified that stickiness. People expected escalation. They didn't get it. Instead, they got space. Space for fans to talk. Space for media to speculate carefully. Space for old moments to be revisited without guidance. That's when the conflict became public-facing. Commentary shifted from, "What is this?" to, "Why does this matter?" And the answer wasn't sensational. It was structural. Because the footage challenged the idea that the public narrative was the full narrative. And once that idea cracks, everything else becomes provisional. The conflict now isn't between two people. It's between story and counter-story. Between a version of events people accepted and a version they hadn't seen before. And here's the part that makes this a first twist rather than a climax. Nothing has been proven and nothing has been denied. The story exists in a suspended state, fueled by timing, restraint, and the uncomfortable feeling that clarity is being postponed for a reason. That's not scandal. That's tension. And tension, once established, demands a release. The escalation didn't happen with a new clip. It happened with reach. What began as quiet circulation suddenly crossed an invisible threshold, the point where a story stops being shared privately and starts being absorbed publicly. The footage didn't need amplification from influencers or headlines to get there. It moved because people kept asking the same question in different spaces. Why does this feel unfinished? That feeling is what pushed it forward. As the clips reached wider audiences, the reaction didn't intensify into outrage, it sharpened into analysis. Viewers weren't watching to be shocked anymore. They were watching to compare, to line up what they were seeing with what they remembered being told, to test coherence. And that's where the shocking reveal emerged. Not from the footage itself, but from what the footage changed about everything else. People began noticing that the strongest reactions weren't coming from detractors. They were coming from longtime supporters who had trusted the existing narrative and now felt unsettled by the gaps. Their comments weren't accusatory. They were confused. Confusion is powerful because it doesn't accuse, it asks. Why does this moment exist off-camera if the story was always complete? Why does this tone feel unfamiliar if the public image was consistent? Why is the response delayed if clarity has always been a priority? Those questions stacked up quickly. The reveal, insiders say, was the realization that this wasn't a clip war. It was a credibility test. The footage didn't need to prove wrongdoing to alter perception. It only needed to demonstrate that there were unseen chapters that hadn't been integrated into the public story. Once that realization set in, the escalation became inevitable. Media outlets tread carefully, choosing words like alleged, unverified, context matters. But even cautious coverage widened the audience, and with it, the scrutiny. The more carefully people spoke, the more it signaled that the situation carried real reputational weight. Meanwhile, the X's continued silence took on new meaning. At first, it looked respectful. Then it looked strategic. Finally, it looked like confidence, the kind that suggests the information doesn't need selling. That posture unsettled observers more than an aggressive push ever could have. Silence, when paired with evidence, invites audiences to decide for themselves. And audiences did. They began pulling threads that weren't about the footage at all. Timelines, messaging shifts, changes in tone across appearances, moments when explanations were offered quickly in the past contrasted with the current delay. This wasn't about catching contradictions, it was about sensing incongruity. That's the reveal that changed the balance. Because once a story becomes about incongruity, every response, or lack of one, becomes part of the evidence. Addressing it risks validating the importance of the footage. Ignoring it risks confirming it matters. The options narrow fast. Insiders describe this phase as narrative compression. The window to respond shrinks as interpretations solidify. Not because facts are established, but because beliefs are. And beliefs are sticky. The escalation accelerated when a subtle development occurred, one that didn't add new information but reframed intent. Viewers noticed how quickly conversations shifted from "what is in the clip" to "why was this never mentioned?" That shift reframed the issue from content to curation. Curation implies choice. Choice implies intention. That implication is the shock. It suggests the public narrative may have been selective, not false, but incomplete. And incompleteness, once suspected, draws more attention than denial ever could. By now, the discourse wasn't asking for receipts. It was asking for integration, a way to reconcile the footage with the story people had accepted. Without that integration, the story remains suspended, and suspension is uncomfortable. The escalation, then, isn't louder, it's tighter. Every day without clarification narrows the range of interpretations. Every careful word from adjacent voices increases the sense that this matters. Every attempt to move on is read as avoidance rather than closure. And here's the final turn of this phase. The footage no longer needs to circulate. Its impact has detached from its presence. People are talking about what it represents, private moments existing outside a polished public frame, and how often that happens without being acknowledged. The conversation has expanded from a single figure to a broader question about narrative control. That's why this moment feels explosive without being chaotic. It has shifted the burden, no longer on the source to explain why it exists, but on the public figure to explain how it fits. Until that happens, the story doesn't escalate with noise, it escalates with expectation. By the time the conversation reached this phase, it was no longer confined to fan spaces. It had crossed into a more consequential arena, the one where institutions move carefully, language tightens, and silence becomes policy. That shift changed everything. What stood out immediately was how cautious coverage became. Outlets that usually rushed to frame narratives slowed down. Headlines avoided conclusions. Words like context, timeline, and verification replaced the usual sensational phrasing. On the surface, that looked responsible. Underneath, it signaled something else. People understood the stakes. Because when media treats a story gently, it's often because the implications stretch beyond a single clip. Industry observers noted the pattern right away. Commentators didn't ask whether the footage was real. They asked whether it was representative, and that distinction matters. Representation speaks to credibility, not guilt. It asks whether the public story has been selective, not whether anyone committed a specific act. That framing stuck. Panels and podcasts leaned into meta discussion. How narratives are built, how personal history gets curated into public identity, how relationships that end quietly can leave behind unintegrated moments that resurface later. The footage became an example, not an accusation. And examples are dangerous because they generalize. Inside professional circles, reactions were even more restrained. Advisors cautioned against public commentary. Collaborators avoided references altogether. It wasn't fear, it was risk management. Any statement could be read as endorsement, dismissal, or deflection. Neutrality became the safest position. Neutrality, however, isn't invisible. Fans noticed which voices stayed quiet and which ones spoke only in abstractions. Posts about growth, privacy, and moving forward appeared without names attached. That kind of messaging doesn't calm audiences, it invites interpretation. People read between the lines, especially when lines are carefully drawn. Meanwhile, the absence of a direct response from Erika Kirk continued to shape perception. Not negatively at first, many assumed deliberation. But as days passed, deliberation began to look like avoidance of integration. The public wasn't asking for an apology or a denial, they were asking for coherence. How does this footage sit inside the story they already know? Without that answer, speculation filled the gap. Industry analysts pointed out another subtle reaction: platform behavior. Clips were handled cautiously. Some algorithms limited spread, others allowed discussion but suppressed reposts of the original footage. That uneven treatment suggested a balancing act: allow conversation, avoid amplification. Again, restraint signaled sensitivity. Sensitivity implies consequence. The reaction from peers followed a similar pattern. No pile-ons, no public defenses, just distance. In celebrity ecosystems, distance isn't always judgment, it's self-preservation. People wait to see how a story settles before aligning themselves with any interpretation. That waiting period creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Longtime supporters expressed disappointment not because of what they saw, but because of what they didn't hear. Even a short explanation would help, became a common refrain. Others pushed back, warning against entitlement to private history. The debate wasn't about right or wrong. It was about expectation versus access. That debate spilled outward. Cultural commentators began asking whether audiences have been conditioned to expect transparency that public figures can't reasonably provide. At the same time, they questioned whether carefully curated identities invite scrutiny precisely because they promise clarity. When clarity pauses, trust wobbles. Trust wobbling is the real reaction here. Institutions don't panic when clips surface. They react when trust becomes uncertain. And uncertainty is exactly what this moment introduced. Not chaos, not scandal. Ambiguity with weight. By now, the story had reframed itself. It wasn't hidden footage surfaces. It was what happens when private moments collide with a public narrative that relied on continuity. That's a question with implications far beyond one person, which is why the industry stayed measured. Because measured responses don't end conversations, they slow them, letting beliefs settle. And once beliefs settle, they're harder to shift than headlines. This phase didn't produce answers. It produced alignment around a single idea: something needs to be integrated, or this won't resolve. And that realization sets up the final turn. The final twist didn't come from a new clip. It didn't come from the X. And it didn't come from a statement. It came from what everyone suddenly realized at the same time. This situation was no longer about the footage. It was about the choice not to contextualize it. Insiders say that, behind the scenes, this became the most uncomfortable phase of all. Not because the story was spiraling, but because it was solidifying. When a narrative stays unanswered long enough, it stops feeling unresolved and starts feeling intentional, is where interpretation hardens into belief. That's the moment everything changed. Up until now, silence could still be framed as caution, as legal advice, as privacy. But as the days passed, observers noticed something chilling. Nothing else was filling the space. No adjacent clarification. No indirect acknowledgement. No reframing through trusted intermediaries. The silence wasn't just holding, it was holding firm. That firmness became the twist. Because silence isn't neutral when the audience has already seen something that doesn't fit. At that point, silence becomes a position. And positions tell stories of their own. Industry watchers began saying the same thing quietly. This isn't being ignored, it's being waited out. Waiting out a story only works when attention fades, but attention didn't fade here, it deepened. People stopped refreshing for updates and started reinterpreting what already existed. That's when memory kicked in. Old moments resurfaced, not viral, not dramatic, just reconsidered. Interviews where answers felt overly polished, situations that once seemed insignificant but now felt adjacent. Choices that previously looked like preference now looked like boundary management. None of this accused wrongdoing, but all of it suggested awareness, and awareness is heavy. The most unsettling development, according to insiders, was how the conversation shifted from what happened to what was allowed to be seen. That's a dangerous reframing, because it doesn't depend on evidence, it depends on curation. Who decides what version of events becomes official? And what happens when unofficial versions surface without explanation? That's where the cliffhanger locks in, because the public is no longer waiting for proof. They're waiting for integration, a way to reconcile the footage with the identity they were shown. A way to understand how both can exist without contradiction. And until that reconciliation happens, the story remains open, not chaotic, but unsettled. Insiders say this is the phase public figures fear most. Not backlash, not outrage, but the slow crystallization of an unanswered question. Because once audiences internalize a question without an answer, they carry it forward, into every future appearance, every interview, every statement that pretends the moment didn't happen. The footage has already done its job. It introduced doubt, it exposed fragility, and it forced a pause that no one can unsee. The cliffhanger isn't about what the X will do next. It isn't about whether more footage exists. It's about whether silence will remain the chosen response. Because if silence continues, it becomes the loudest message of all. And here's the final, uncomfortable truth insiders are circling. When a story reaches this stage, the next move doesn't have to be dramatic to be decisive. It could be a single sentence months from now, a passing comment, a moment of candor that reframes everything retroactively. Or it could be nothing at all, and nothing, over time, becomes its own explanation. This isn't a scandal racing toward resolution, it's a question settling into permanence. And once a question becomes permanent, it changes how every future move is read. That's where this ends, for now. Not with answers, but with attention that hasn't gone away. And attention, once trained on silence, doesn't let go easily. Now pause for a second, because this is the moment where the audience decides what this story becomes next. Not the footage, not the X, not even the silence. You. Ask yourself honestly, if the clips meant nothing, why did they need to be handled so carefully? If context would clear everything up, why hasn't that context arrived? And if silence was meant to protect privacy, why does it feel more like avoidance of integration than closure? That's not an accusation. That's an observation. And observations are exactly what power struggles are afraid of. So let's talk. Do you think Erika Kirk is choosing silence to protect herself, or to protect a narrative that can't easily absorb what people have now seen? Do you believe audiences are owed any explanation when private footage collides with a carefully presented public identity? Or is this the cost of following public figures who promise transparency until transparency becomes inconvenient? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but don't rush them. This isn't about hot takes, it's about patterns. About what silence communicates when it's prolonged. About how credibility shifts when unanswered questions linger long enough to become permanent background noise. If you noticed the shift before anyone explained it, hit that like button. If you think stories don't end just because people stop addressing them, subscribe right now. And if you want to be first when the next development reframes this, again turn on notifications. Because here's the truth, most people won't say out loud, stories like this don't resolve when someone speaks. They resolve when the audience stops believing silence is neutral. And once that happens, every future appearance, every interview, every carefully chosen word will be filtered through the same question: what isn't being said, and why? We'll be here tracking every shift, every pause, every moment where silence does more talking than words ever could. Stay observant, stay critical, and remember, when footage disappears but questions remain, the story hasn't ended. It's only waiting for the moment silence finally breaks or becomes the explanation itself.